Yo, what's going on, everybody? So today we are back on the slideshow. This is going to be a bit more of a lecture slash educational type of video. And today we're going to be talking about a topic that is really not talked about a lot in, I guess, in today's fitness society, if that's even a word, but in just the general landscape of the fitness industry nowadays. And that is the potential benefits of higher body fat percentages for building maximum amounts of muscle tissue. So this is actually really uncommon and not really spoke about a lot. I believe that the main reason because of that is honestly because of Instagram, and I think that nowadays in the fitness industry, with people posting pictures year round of their physiques, and especially competitors who, when they post pictures of themselves deep into the off season and they still have separated quads and a shredded six pack, and they're talking about how fat they are. If you're deep into your off season and you don't have shredded quads or separated six pack, like, that makes you feel like you're really, really fat. And so I think that this general notion that higher body fat percentages have no benefits for bodybuilders is kind of being overplayed, and I think that there's some potential benefits to them. Now there's going to be some caveats and some limitations to all of this kind of stuff that we're going to get into as we go throughout this video. But for now, we're just going to get started on the general concept. So I want to make this clear before we start that what I am not advocating is a dirty bulk. In fact, what I'm going to be calling this is a perma-bulk. And the only reason why I'm calling it a perma-bulk is quite literally for lack of a better phrase. I'm not very creative, so I'm just going to be calling it a perma-bulk. But what I mean by perma-bulk is just simply an extended bulking phase. So not necessarily, I don't mean quite literally you're bulking permanently. Which we will get into as we go through, as there are some athletes who do permanently bulk and are going to help back up my points here. But just so you're aware that what I am not advocating is a dirty bulk. And if you're confused on what the difference between the two is if you look at the two, you're going to see people who partake in a dirty bulk. A significant amount of their diet generally consists of junk food, which they use as an excuse that they're bulking. So eating an entire pizza to themselves is okay. Generally, people who are engaged in a dirty bulk, I hate to stereotype, but some of the heavier powerlifters, they're not necessarily concerned with their training performance or their health. And their main concern is getting in as many calories as possible, and they don't really care where those calories come from. They're purely concerned on calories and not necessarily the food choices. Now, what I am going to be advocating in certain situations is the perma-bulk, in which your diet is based around nutrient-dense, clean food, bodybuilder-friendly food. Chicken, steak, eggs, salmon, rice, potatoes, oats, bread, etc., etc. During this phase, you should be focused on keeping your performance and the health at the forefront of your priorities. And I will talk about this more as we get later into the lecture. But you need to understand that if you're going to be going through an extended bulking phase, obviously your body fat levels are going to climb. And up to a certain point, those body fat levels climbing could potentially put your health at some short-term risks. And so if you're already doing something that's going to put yourself at some short-term health risks, if you're an enhanced athlete on top of that, taking anabolic steroids, oral or injectable, that are going to put you at an even further health risk, it's really important that the food choices that you're making do not compound on top of all of those health risks and really put you into some more, really put you into a deep hole that you may not be able to dig yourself out of. You are keeping a steady, consistent caloric surplus that isn't overly aggressive. Again, something that I'll talk about towards the end. And all that we're really doing here is we're extending our bulking period past the point in which most other people tend to cut off their bulking period. So I don't really want to give blanket statements in terms of numbers, but let's say that most males will generally bulk up until, let's say, 15 or 16, maybe 17, 18% body fat. And then generally around there is when they tend to cut off their bulk. And all that we're really advocating here is that instead of cutting your bulk off at that point, you continue forward into the bulking phase and put on, albeit a higher body fat percentage, but there could potentially be some benefits to that, which we will talk about. So the main benefit of being at these higher body weights and higher body fat percentages is the theory of multiple muscle nuclei. So it's important to understand. I've got a picture of a muscle fiber here, and we're going to be focusing here on the nucleus. I know all of you guys watching this just had like a flashback and a nightmare going back to high school biology, remembering that the nucleus is the powerhouse of the cell. The nucleus is the powerhouse of the cell. But in this situation, it's kind of important that we understand about the nucleus and how the nucleus of cells contain, amongst many other things, they contain a lot of the DNA transcription material that we need in order to promote growth. As I was saying, muscle cells are one of the few cells in the human body that have the potential to contain multiple nuclei. And these nuclei are built from being exposed into heavy training. So the more that you expose your muscle tissue and you break down and you tear down your muscle tissue from the heavy training stimulus, as these muscle cells and these muscle fibers regrow to protect against the stimulus, they have the potential to create multiple muscle nuclei. Each one of these nuclei within the muscle cell, they have the potential to contribute not only to the growth of new skeletal muscle tissue, but to the maintenance of that skeletal muscle tissue as well. And so because of that, we can safely hypothesize that the more nuclei that a muscle fiber or a muscle cell has, there is more growth that can be had from that muscle cell, or at least more potential for growth. Now, all that we really need here is the potential for growth. Whether or not more growth takes place is going to determine based more on our training program and our nutritional approach. But from the training itself, getting these multiple nuclei into the muscle cell is going to be the main goal. It's also important to note that once these muscle nuclei are obtained and they are placed within the muscle cell, they are permanent and they cannot be destroyed or defeated. I mean, I can assume that the muscle cells can probably, or the nuclei in the muscle cell can probably be destroyed if something catastrophic were to happen, like say maybe some severe burns or something were to happen to the area and it completely destroyed some of the muscle tissue or something like that, maybe more of like a horrific accident. But with the exception of that, once these muscle nuclei are obtained, they are permanent. And the way that we know this, besides obvious studies and research and all that kind of stuff, is this can help explain the theory of muscle memory. And so this is especially true with enhanced athletes. So if you see people who at one point during their life, maybe they hopped on some anabolic steroids or they did something of that sort, and they put on a super physiological amount of muscle tissue. Once they stopped taking those anabolic steroids, they still have larger amounts of muscle mass than someone who is not using drugs would have. And that's because during that time period, their body built so many muscle nuclei within their muscle tissue. And once those muscle nuclei are built, they cannot be destroyed. So even though that person is no longer still on anabolics, they still have the muscle nuclei population, we'll call it, that they achieved from the anabolic steroids themselves. And even going back to natural athletes and not really talking about enhanced athletes, this also further describes muscle nuclei. As if you take somebody who was say a top level natural athlete, and then they, for whatever reason, personal or injury or something, they took some extended time off of the gym and their muscles seem to have atrophied and they seem to have gotten smaller. Once they get back into training, that muscle memory notion where the muscle comes back into its full size and strength very, very quickly helps support the idea that once these muscle nuclei are in the muscle tissue, it's very, very unlikely that they are to go anywhere. So how does all of that relate to hypertrophy? I'm going to get this guy out of the way down here. All right. So these muscle nuclei can only be created when the body is in a hypercaloric state, which for people who this is very simple, but people who don't know the difference between hypercaloric and hypocaloric state means a caloric surplus. So you are providing your body with the raw materials that it needs in order to promote growth and anabolism. Just like muscle tissue, these muscle nuclei can only be created when your body is in a hypercaloric state. So what I like to refer this to is kind of like building a house, right? If you want to build a house from scratch, you need to continuously supply the materials that you need in order to build that house. If you are wanting to build a house from scratch and say you only have a set number of bricks or you only have a set number of, I don't know, any material, eventually you're going to run out. And in order to continue to make progress, you're going to need to add more supplies to that, which it is kind of an equation that I like to use for needing to be in a caloric surplus in order to build muscle tissue. This isn't a video of whether or not you can build muscle in a deficit, but it's very widely recognized that with the caveat of some certain experiences, building muscle tissue in a caloric deficit is not possible. And so what we need to be in is a hypercaloric state where we are constantly providing the raw materials for our body to create more muscle nuclei, which will then henceforth create more muscle tissue. So by spending a longer time in a hypercaloric state, we are increasing the chances and the probability that our body is creating more and more muscle nuclei, because dropping into a hypocaloric state, which is a caloric deficit, prevents muscle nuclei from being created. Now, this is kind of common sense. Let's say over the course of a 12-month calendar year, if we spend 6 months in a surplus and 6 months in a deficit, then we're spending 50% of that year where we could potentially be building more muscle nuclei, and then 50% of the year where we may not be building any, we definitely will not be building any muscle nuclei at all. And so if we can kind of shift the ratio and the tides of that maybe to 9 months out of the year, we're in a hypercaloric state, or 12 months out of the year, we're in a hypercaloric state. The more time that we spend in a caloric surplus and the more time that we spend in a hypercaloric state, our chances of building more muscle nuclei and therefore building more muscle tissue increase significantly, because we're spending more and more time in a state of eating, which allows those raw materials to be present to build more muscle tissue. Now, once those muscle nuclei have been obtained, not only will you have acquired more muscle than what you normally would have if you would have stayed leaner and dropped into a deficit, but you will also be able to maintain more of that muscle during your next dieting phase, because once those muscle nuclei are created, they are permanent. And this is proven by the fact that the athletes who have been measured that have the highest amounts of lean muscle mass and lean body mass in general are sumo wrestlers. Now, it's important to understand also that sumo wrestlers also have the highest measured amounts of fat mass. But what I'm trying to draw a correlation with from here is that sumo wrestlers are huge, and sumo wrestlers eat and eat and eat and eat and eat. And I'm obviously not very versed in the sport of sumo wrestling, but I would assume that there is probably very little time frame, if any time frame at all, for sumo wrestlers where they drop into a caloric deficit or they drop into a dieting phase in order to try and lose some weight, unless the amount of weight that they're carrying is probably inhibiting their athletic performance, which is another thing that we're going to get into as we go forward. Excuse me. But what we are kind of drawing a conclusion here is that if you are somebody who, true to the phrase permanent bulks, perma-bulk, like you bulk for 15 years straight with no chance of dropping into a diet phase at all, the longer that you spend in that hypercaloric state, the more muscle mass that you will acquire. And it's kind of safe to hypothesize that if we were to take somebody like a sumo wrestler who has these huge amounts of lean muscle mass from spending so much time in a caloric surplus, and we were to diet these sumo wrestlers down into more healthy and normal body fat levels, these guys may be the biggest in terms of muscle size here and muscle mass. Sumo wrestlers may be the biggest athletes on the planet. And because that they have so many muscle nuclei within their muscle, the odds of them losing any of that muscle tissue through dieting is very, very, very low. All right, so let's get into some caveats and some limitations about this whole process here. So while the ideal that the longer time that you spent in a caloric surplus or the longer that your bulking phase will eventually provide more muscle mass from the increased amount of muscle nuclei is proven by sumo wrestlers and quite a few world-class bodybuilders, it is important to understand that there is a point of diminishing returns with your body fat gain. And again, as far as putting hard numbers and blanket statements on things, I'm not a big fan, but for the sake of this video, we'll say anything around 25% body fat for males or higher and about 35% for females or higher is generally not going to give you any benefits other than some negative performance and then your negative health risks. You're going to see some increased blood pressure, some decreased insulin sensitivity, amongst many other things. I believe past like 25% body fat for males is where they start labeling you as medically obese. So, I mean, if you want to know the health risks of being obese, you can obviously Google those, but being obese is not gonna provide any benefit for you as a male or a female if you're a physique competitor. Now, up until that point, about 25% for males, your insulin sensitivity is actually still very much intact. There are going to be quite a few people in the fitness industry that tell you, like, once you're above 15% body fat, all your body is going to do is store more body fat, and it won't direct any more calories to muscle tissue. And this has actually been proven wrong multiple times. If what we're looking at here is what is called the P ratio, so the letter P here and then ratio. And what the P ratio is it's a way to describe the distribution of calories, okay? So say the amount of calories that you eat, a certain amount of those calories get distributed to fat mass and a certain amount of those calories get distributed into lean mass. And it's hypothesized that the leaner you are, the more those calories get distributed towards lean mass and less towards fat mass. And then as you get more and more fat, for lack of a better word, because your body has more and more body fat on it, people will try to make you believe that that P ratio changes and more calories are going to get distributed towards fat mass than they are going to be distributed towards muscle mass. So they'll say, again, I'm going to use an arbitrary number. Let's say 17% body fat for males, which would be 27% body fat for females. There's about a 10% discrepancy between the two. Anything above, say, 17% for males is going to only yield more body fat gain, and you're not going to get any muscle gain out of continuing to push past that point. But this has been proven wrong multiple times. Now, don't just take my word for it. Let's take a look at some anecdotes here. So this is Lee Priest. I'm going to move this again. This is Lee Priest in 1997. In his off season, right before going on into the 1998 Mr. Olympia. He ended up placing 7th in that Mr. Olympia, and some of you guys are probably thinking, oh, 7th. The late 90s is very, very commonly referred to as the most competitive time frame in competitive bodybuilding history. If you go look at the 1998 Mr. Olympia, you'll see that Lee Priest placed 7th in that Olympia. But if you look at the guys who are in the top 6, like being 7th place in that Olympia is a huge accomplishment. Like the guys that this guy was competing against, let alone the fact that Lee Priest was like 5'3" or 5'4", 5'5", something like that. Like this was before the 212 division. And so these shorter guys didn't have anywhere to go other than the open. Getting 7th place and that stacked of a lineup is incredibly impressive. And this is him a couple weeks out from the 1998 show. If I can get my cursor to show here, I absolutely love this picture because this is one of the most streamlined pictures that I've ever seen. Like this V-taper is absolutely ridiculous. But in his off season before this show, Lee Priest was smooth as butter. Like this guy ate and ate and ate and ate and ate. And Lee Priest in general kind of had a reputation for eating like complete dog shit in the off season. So this may not be a huge good person to use in terms of proving my points here. But I'm just trying to get the point across that somebody at this level, in order to put on the muscle tissue that they need to put on in order to be competitive at the highest level, they're not afraid to eat, and they're not afraid to cut their body fats off at certain points. Dorian Yates has been known in most of his off seasons to have gotten very, very big. And then, as we all know, not only was Dorian the first mass monster, but one of the things that made Dorian so fucking good on stage was not only the fact that he was huge and he was one of the biggest mass monsters, but this guy was absolutely fucking shredded year in and year out. And so being able to balloon up, well, for lack of a better word, we'll say balloon, in order to be able to gain these larger amounts of body fat and get smoother in the off season, allowed him to continuously get bigger and bigger and bigger each year into his Olympias, where he went on to win 6 in a row. We see the same thing with Jay Cutler. Jay Cutler in his off seasons was known for eating over 1,200 grams of carbohydrates a day, and then stepping on stage and being bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger each year. This is one of my favorite pictures of all time, the iconic quad stomp picture. I believe this was 2009. I could be wrong here. And then Ronnie Coleman, the greatest of all time. This guy in all of his off seasons would get very smooth and eat and eat and eat. Same thing as Jay, 1,000 plus grams of carbohydrates a day, tons and tons and tons of food, and then would step on stage year after year after year after year after year with more and more and more and more and more muscle tissue than he had the year before, and would continuously come in absolutely shrink wrapped. I believe this picture is from 2000. I'm not 100% sure here. But and I'm sure a lot of you guys that are watching this video are probably like, oh, we're talking about drug using athletes, enhanced athletes who are using anabolic steroids. Not only can they put on tons of muscle from using the drugs, but they can also lose the fat fairly quickly because of the drugs. All right, let's talk about Alberto Nunez here. Alberto Nunez here is one of the natural guys he is well known for his condition. This guy, in my opinion, Alberto Nunez is one of the guys who just gets absolutely fucking peeled year in and year out when he competes. This guy gets significantly leaner than a lot of drug using athletes do. And this is kind of a notorious picture of Alberto Nunez back in the, I don't remember what year, early 2000s or something like that, where he was on the bodybuilding.com forums, and he had, in this particular bulking phase, I believe he was like 250 pounds, maybe 255 pounds. Obviously, you can tell by looking at him, he is smooth as shit, but you can also tell by looking at him that there's a ton of fucking muscle mass under that frame. And this is a guy that doesn't use drugs at all. Like, this is a guy who just trains his ass off and eats. And this particular time frame, he was not concerned about his body fat gain. He just ate and ate and ate and trained and trained and trained, built a shitload of muscle tissue. And then when he diets all off, in my opinion, he's one of the most aesthetic looking natural bodybuilders out there, just purely because of his flow and his shape. And then also just because he gets so fucking shredded. So now that we've kind of shown some anecdotes here, let's talk about the application of this and some of the things that you need to consider if you want to embark on a phase like this. So I think it's important to understand that this is going to be more difficult mentally for you than it is going to be physically. You are mentally not going to like the way that you look in the present moment, but I think it's important to understand that doing this could potentially pay off big for you in the future. And I put keep the goal, and that's a phase that or a phrase, excuse me, that I really like, especially in this circumstance. Because if your goal, I'm speaking about competitors here, if your goal is to step on stage with the highest amount of muscle mass that you can possibly carry on your frame, then taking some time away from being really lean and potentially being in a bigger and fluffier state is going to help get you closer to that goal. So when I say keep the goal, I mean that keep that goal of being huge on stage as your primary goal. And even though in this temporary moment, you're not going to like how you look, you need to keep your eyes set on the prize years down the road. Now, kind of touched on this earlier in the beginning, bulking to a higher body fat percentage doesn't mean that you bulk more aggressively than you normally would, and you start going into these 500, 800, 1,000 calorie surpluses where you're gaining 5 pounds of body weight a month. All that we're doing is we're increasing the time frame of the bulk. So I like to keep the rate of gain anywhere from 1 to 2% of body weight gain per month, and that should not change. Just to give general ballpark recommendations, you guys can crunch a calculator on your own. If you're 200 pounds, 1% body weight gain per month, you would be gaining 2 pounds per month. 2%, you would be gaining 4 pounds per month. 2% would be a little bit more aggressive. I like to keep it closer to 1%, maybe somewhere between like 1.5%, somewhere in there. So you're obviously in a caloric surplus and your body weight is increasing, but you're not doing it in a way where you're just gaining absurd amounts of body fat. You're still keeping your surplus very moderate. I would say anywhere from 300 to 400 calories per day, somewhere in there. And you slowly gain weight, but then once you get to the point in which you would normally cut it off, you just continue. But because you continue into these higher body fat percentages, that doesn't mean that you just go full-blown fuck it mode and you start eating garbage. You keep that slower rate of gain per month. Now, because you are gaining weight slowly and you're going to be going into higher body fat amounts, that means that the length of your bulk is going to be very long. So let's say that you're starting off a bulking phase at like 10% body fat, and say you're going to bulk up into the 20 to 22% body fat range. If you're going to be doing that at about a 1% body fat gain per month, or 1% body or 1.5% body weight gain per month, in order for you to go from 10 to 20% body fat, that's going to be at least a 10 to 12 month bulking phase. And so what does that mean for you? That means that most likely during the summer months when you're on vacation and you're on the beach, because your bulking phase is so long and you're not taking any time away from that bulking phase, you are probably going to be bulking throughout the summer, which means that when you are on the beach and shit, you're probably not going to look that great. Now, I wrote here, this depends on your individual goals with fitness. If you are somebody who they lift and they train just so that they can look good on the beach and feel good in their skin, then this isn't for you. If you are a competitor and your goal is to build the largest amount of muscle mass that you can physically carry on your frame, then who fucking cares what you look like during the summer? Okay. So if personal anecdote here, the past 2 years, I have been bulking during the summer. We went to Florida last year for vacation, and we went to Michigan last year on vacation. Obviously, my girlfriend and I took pictures, my family and I took pictures, and I did not like the way that I looked in the pictures in terms of being lean or whatever. But here's the harsh reality of this. One, my girlfriend isn't going to give a shit if I'm fat or if I'm shredded. My family isn't going to give a shit if I'm fat or if I'm shredded. And the people at the beach aren't going to give a shit if I'm fat or if I'm shredded either. So the only person who really cares if I'm fat or if I'm shredded is me. And if my goal is to carry large amounts of muscle tissue, I should not be emotionally attached to how I look like right now, because I know doing what I'm doing right now is going to help me accomplish that goal 2, 3, 4 years down the road. And so this is something that you really need to just mentally overcome. And it has very little to do with your physical status, I guess you could say. Obviously, this has a lot to do with like the psychology of bodybuilding, which is another topic for a different day, and how you view yourself and all of that kind of stuff, which I don't want to get too much into. But you need to understand that you may be bulking through the summer, which may not be what you want to do if you are a general population fitness person. Now, I recommend that keeping cardio in during this phase is going to be important to helping you stick to the plan. And why we're keeping cardio in is not for the sake of caloric expenditure and help keeping you lean, because obviously we don't give a shit about being lean. Failing to do cardio, combined with the fact that you're eating more and more food and your body weight is getting heavier and heavier and heavier, and you're holding more and more and more body fat, this is going to lead to decreased cardiovascular fitness. And this is going to make you feel really slow, really sluggish, and out of shape. So when I was at the peak of my bulk, let's say I have no idea numbers, let's say 22-ish% body fat. When I would go for a walk with my girlfriend and my dog around the neighborhood, if I had skipped my cardio for a couple weeks in a row, like I was out of breath and I was in pain from taking the dog on a walk around the block. Now, if you are putting yourself in that situation where you feel slow and sluggish and terrible and out of shape, that is really going to tempt you to stop bulking and drop into a deficit, which is what we don't want to do here. We want to keep the amount of time that we're in a hypercaloric state as high as possible. And so by keeping cardio in, I'm talking like 20 or 30 minutes, 3 to 4 times a week, where you're actually pushing the cardio and you're having a little bit of a more elevated heart rate. Within your weight training, don't cut out the 15 to 20 to 25 rep sets. Keep those in simply for the fact of keeping your cardiovascular fitness in check. I have been 25% body fat, potentially higher in high school, but I was very cardiovascularly fit because I was doing CrossFit training for football. So just because that you're at a high body fat percentage doesn't mean that you necessarily have to be fat, sluggish, and out of shape. I mean, look at NFL offensive and defensive linemen. Some of these guys are huge, but they have better cardiovascular endurance than like your high school running backs or some of your college level running backs. So just because that you're a higher body fat percentage does not mean that you need to allow your cardiovascular fitness to slip and degrade, because that's going to make you feel really, really shitty. And when you feel really, really shitty, you're going to be really tempted in order to cut the bulk off and stop. Now, this is the final thing that we need to consider. This is obviously for competitors. Every pound that you gain will eventually need to be lost if you are a competitor. So if you are going to do something like this, an extended off-season and gaining phase where you push into higher body fat levels, and then you plan on going from that higher body fat level into your contest prep, you need to be smart about how much time you give yourself in terms of getting into shape. What I would recommend is you take that in phases. So let's say you finish your bulk at 20% body fat. Let's say you do a diet where you drop from 20% body fat to like 15% body fat, and then you take a diet break, and then you maintain 15% body fat for 2 to 4 weeks. And then you drop from that 15% body fat into 10% body fat, and then you do another 2 to 4 week diet break. And then from that 10% body fat, you start your legitimate contest prep where you're trying to get everything off. Do not try to go from 20% body fat to 4% body fat straight in one go, and absolutely do not try to do that in a short amount of time. Like, this is going to be a considerably longer dieting phase, because now you have a lot more body fat than you used to have. Now, obviously, this is going to lead to a longer dieting phase, but at the end of that longer dieting phase, if you did everything right in the off season, there's going to be quite a bit more muscle tissue waiting for you at the end of that dieting phase. So again, this is where you need to be patient, keep strong mentally, and just keep the goal the goal. So now, finally, who is this applicable for in my personal experience and personal professional recommendation? Who is this applicable for? So I think that this is applicable for competitors who are taking an extended off season. So maybe they're taking 2 to 3 to 4 years away from competing. The main reason why you're probably taking an extended off season, with the exception of, say, life things happening, is that you need more muscle mass. And so if you need more muscle mass, you should really take away from this period of being away from the stage for a long time and push and eat. Who cares if you're 20 to 25% body fat, because you're not stepping on stage for another 3 years. If you can't go from 25% body fat to 15% body fat, like a reasonable body fat level, within the next 3 years, then you have way more things to worry about than whether or not you should push up to 25% body fat. I also think that this is applicable for natural athletes who are close to their genetic potential. And I think that this is a good idea for people like that, because if you're an athlete who is very close to their genetic potential, it is quite possible that the only way that you can build more muscle mass is by pushing into those higher body fat levels and building muscle nuclei, because you've been doing this for so long and you're so close to your genetic potential that bulking up to 15, 16, 17% body fat and only spending 6 to 8 months out of the year in a caloric surplus just isn't cutting it anymore, because you're so close to your genetic potential. So you need to continue to push further and further and further. And if you're a natural athlete and you push up, let's say 25% body fat or so, and then you diet down and it gives you 2 to 3 pounds more muscle tissue, if you thought that you were close to your genetic potential before, and then you do a bulking phase where you gain 2 to 3 pounds more muscle tissue, that proves that you really weren't as close to your genetic potential as you thought you were. You were just leaving muscle on the table by not sucking it up and pushing up into a higher body fat percentage in order to acquire that muscle. Finally, I think that this could potentially be applicable for athletes who are undergoing their first cycle of anabolic steroids and potentially their first couple of anabolic steroids. So by introducing those anabolic steroids into their body, the amount of what I am calling anabolic activity, for lack of a better word, going on inside their body is so high that it could be beneficial for those athletes to take 100% advantage of that opportunity and just eat. So now I understand that by taking anabolic steroids, that could potentially allow you to build muscle in a deficit, or it could potentially help you to build muscle by eating, by being less aggressive with your surplus. But let's say you do a 16-week anabolic cycle where you eat at like maintenance and you gain 5 pounds of muscle, or you do a 16-week steroid cycle where you eat at a 500 calorie or 400 calorie surplus, and instead of gaining 5 pounds of muscle, you gain 15 pounds of muscle. So because you have the potential to gain so much muscle from using steroids for the first time, I think that it's really beneficial for somebody like that to take full advantage of that opportunity and just eat and eat and eat and eat and eat and push into these higher body fat percentages so that they can take advantage of all of that anabolic activity and build the largest amount of muscle that they ever have in the shortest amount of time. Okay. All right, guys. Hope you liked the video. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment in the description. Hit me up on Instagram, and you can follow me there. Obviously, ask me questions. If you guys are interested in training or nutrition coaching, I have my coaching email in the description. Other than that, if you like the video, give it a thumbs up, and I hope you guys have a great day.